Hi, welcome to our video of our case study. Our team is conformed by Juan Pablo Valle, Lorea Alvarez, Andrea Bravo, Regina Preciado, and me, Maria Jimenez, and I'm going to start talking about Yom Kippur. Well, first of all, you need to know that Yom Kippur is the most important day on the Jewish calendar, is the most important holiday, and is also known as the Day of Forgiveness. And well, the Yom Kippur War in 1973 was born from unresolved situations and problems of the Six Days War and is marked as a highlight in the Arab and Israeli conflicts. It initiated with surprise attacks from Syria and Egypt on Yom Kippur, the holiday, and it led to battles and tensions between United States and the USSR. And well, despite initial fears and problems, Israel rapidly moved its forces and received support from the USA. Well, also answering the first question, Israel got a lot of help. The United States sent military supplies to Israel during the conflict through some strategic operations known as the Operation Nickelgrass. The Operation Nickelgrass. Um, the Soviet Union transported military supplies to Egypt to support it. And they also initiated an airlift of military aid to Syria. Now I'm going to mention 5 important people who are directly involved in the conflict. The first one is Golda Meir, that was the Prime Minister of Israel during the Yom Kippur War. And obviously, she was very important for the conflict because she was the fundamental role to express the country's response to the conflict. Then we have Anwar Sadat, that was the president of Egypt at the time, and he led the Egyptian military on an attack against Israel. Then we have Hafez al-Assad, that was the president of Syria during Yom Kippur, and he ordered Syrian forces to join Egypt against Israel. Then we have Henry Kissinger, that was the United States Secretary at the time, and he played a main role in diplomatic efforts and in peace agreements. And last but not least, we have Leonid Brezhnev. I don't know if I'm spelling correctly. That was the General Secretary of Communist Party in the USSR. He supported Egypt and Syria with military aid, and he contributed to the dynamics of the conflict and its eventual resolution. Now I'm going to answer question 3. So during the conflict, the countries involved chose sides based on their interest, not in the Cold War alliances. And Egypt and Syria, supported by the USSR, fought mainly to reclaim land from Israel, not because of communist ideologies. Israel, that was supported by the United States, focused on self-defense rather than capitalist ideals. Even though the war was more about local issues than global ideologies. During Yom Kippur, there was this fear of nuclear war because the United States and the USSR were both nuclear armed supported enemies. Despite these fears, both focused on diplomacy rather than using their weapons. And this war highlighted the importance of diplomacy and respect, and the peaceful resolution through the Camp David Accords show that dialogue and compromise are key to maintain stability and peace. Thank you.
Hi, my name is Lorea and I'm going to talk about the Hungarian Revolution. Here's a brief context about the Hungarian Revolution. So, the Hungarian Revolution took place in Hungary in 1956 and was followed after a speech by a Soviet leader named Nikita Khrushchev. He really criticized Stalin's era and was inspired by freedom of debate and criticism, which basically made the revolution that started in October specifically. They began to revolt against the USSR control under the Stalin government, as we can see here in the picture. At first, the revolutionaries won and applied a multi-party system agreed by Nagre, but then the revolution started to fail. They wanted to reform the society, but then the state protection came into the picture, and that's when it started to fail. Hungarians started to fight against the state protection, and as every country did, they started to kill. Indeed, the USSR and the USA interfered in this conflict, but they didn't get anything from it. The USSR showed actually weakness because as Hungary was under their control, by this revolution being a failed, it only showed weakness. They didn't get anything from it directly, but we have to remember this conflict was during the Cold War, so they gained from that, like their support helped them during the Cold War. I mentioned 5 important characters during this revolution. Hungarian socialist, politician, and leader of the Hungarian Revolution. Kadar, Hungarian politician and prime minister. Khrushchev, first secretary of the Communist Party of the USSR and minister of the USSR. Tildy, Hungarian politician, last prime minister, and proceeded to be president of the republic. Yuri Andropov, leader of the USSR from 1983 to 1984. The involved countries were sided, of course, the USSR with the communism, since they had that way of thinking, and the USA supported the capitalists because they were sided with the Hungarian revolutionaries. Supported by giving them a place to stay and an opportunity to make their own life at the United States, but didn't want to interfere directly because they didn't want to create a nuclear conflict. Consequences were migration. Thousands of Hungarians had to flee to west because the Soviet army was going against Budapest, and a lot of them were killed by the Red Army. They also suffered with international relations because Hungary stayed under control of under the USSR, and it strengthened Hungary's position with the Eastern Bloc. The biggest consequence was that the revolution showed weakness of the Eastern European community, equality between Eastern Europe and the Bloc. In this conflict in long terms and relating to the revolution, the fuel prices now in Hungary are going up, and that means like saving more money and like not having the accessibility that they had. And I can relate this to the revolution because they were also facing economic problems, and it can bring back the memory of the necessity of such important resources like fuel is.
Hi, I'm Andrea Bravo, and today I'm going to talk about the Cuban Revolution. To starters, the Cuban Revolution was a movement to overthrow the dictatorship of Fulgencio Batista. This was an important and the main event in Cuba to finally overthrow the dictatorship of Fulgencio Batista. This was Fulgencio Batista. And finally to establish a socialist government in Cuba. This main event was led by Che Guevara and Fidel Castro. It all started after the Spanish-American War with the Platt Amendment, when the US started to rule, to have an influence in Cuban affairs, including the military force. It all started with Batista's rise to power in 1952. He was generating a lot of problems and generating discontent in the country. Economic issues, policies, like for example, the Sugar Act of 1956. It was when Fidel Castro started to step in and wanted to put an end to Batista's regime. There were several fails, including the unite an uprising in 1953, followed by the guerrilla campaign. But of course, Batista wanted all the power. He was a dictator, he wanted to rule, he wanted all the power to himself. And that's why the US is important, because the US was having like a lot of pacts with Batista. The US and Batista were against communism, which united them more, because Fidel Castro and Che Guevara were part of the communist group. That's when also the USSR starts to step in to support Fidel Castro. It was like a benefit thing, because the USSR wanted to gain a strategic foothold in the Western Hemisphere by supporting Castro. It included such things to Cuba like economic aid, military assistance, development of nuclear missiles. That's when we can talk about like a possibility of a nuclear war, because the USA and the USSR were having these problems, because the USA was with Batista and USSR was with Castro. It was important because they basically prevented a direct conflict and led to better communication. There was not such a thing like a nuclear war, but it was a huge possibility, because they already had the missiles that the USSR provided them. That's when the elections finally came and basically contributed to Batista's downfall and the success of the Cuban Revolution. After the Cuban Revolution, there were so many big changes that contributed to Cuba. There was a lot of changes in the Cuban Revolution, like the developing of countries and the military aid to insurgents, land distribution, expansion in education and health, but there was a clear political division. Let's say that Cuba right now is not the best place, but if the Cuban Revolution didn't happen, it would be at its worst. Yes, the Cuban Revolution is still haunting them by different information coming to light of different spies or different crucial parts about the Cuban Revolution. Recently, an ex-ambassador, Manuel Rocha, was sentenced guilty for various criminal charges, one of them being related with the espionage of Cuba. When I say that the Cuban Revolution has left a lot of things, and it also hasn't been like fully recovered or fully left in the past, because new things are coming now day and day, but it was a huge part that left a lot of benefits, and it changed the Cuban history for life.
Hello, I'm Regina, and today I'm going to talk about the independence of Congo. Okay, so the Congo crisis was a time of political crisis between 1960 and 1965. This crisis began almost immediately when Congo became independent from Belgium. When Congo became independent from Belgium unofficially, this man was in charge of Congo, who was Joseph Désiré Mobutu. Constituting a series of civil war, the Congo crisis was proxy conflict in the Cold War, in which the Soviet Union and the United States supported opposite factions. A rebel government of the Free Republic of Congo was founded on the eastern city of Stanleyville, who was still led by supporters of Lumumba, who was this man right here, by Anthony Gasenga, who was this man right here. These were the Simbas, and these people took control of a significant amount of territory and proclaimed communism, People's Republic of Congo, and Stanleyville. Now, was there any interface of the USA or the USSR in the conflict? The Soviets and their allies lent their support of a variety Marxist national liberation movement, with their was supporting anti-community forces. The provision of diplomatic and military aid both sides to expand their influences in Africa at the expense of the other. In August 1960, the US government launched a covert political program in the Congo lasting 7 years. Initially aimed to eliminate Lumumba from the power and replacing him with a more moderate pro-Western leader. The US government provided advice and financial subsidies. Some of the most important characters in this crisis. Most important people that I already have talked about was this man who was Patrice Lumumba. He was a Congolese politician and independent leader. He was the first prime minister of the Democratic Republic of Congo from June until September of 1960. Another one was King Baudouin. He addressed the nation by radio. And also he declared that Belgium would work towards the full independence of the Belgian Congo. Now let's talk about Moise Ntombe. He was a Congolese businessman and politician. He served as the president of the secessionist state of Kangatan from 1960 to 1963, and also as a prime minister of the Democratic Republic of Congo from 1964 to 1965. An important person was Dag Hammarskjöld. He was the Secretary General at the time of the UN. Last but not least was Joseph Kasavubu. He was a member of the Congo ethnic group. He became the leader of the Alliance for Congo, or the Abaku Party, in the 1950s. And soon he became a leading proponent of the Congo's independence and Belgium colonial rule. He became the first country's president, with Patrice Lumumba as a prime minister. There were a lot of countries that were involved in this crisis. Some of them were Belgium, the United Nations, the United States, and the Soviet Union. Belgium ruling the Congo was based on the Trinity of States missionary and the private company interests. The privilege of Belgian commercials interests meant a large amount of capital flows into the Congo and that individual regions became specialized. The United Nations, in response of the Congolese government appeal for assistance on 14 July 1960, the United Nations Security Council passed a resolution. The resolution called on Belgium to withdraw the troops and authorized the UN Security General to provide the Congolese government with military assistance. The United States was concerned about the spread of communism in Africa and supported the Congolese government led by Patrice Lumumba. The Soviet Union agreed to provide weapons and logical and material support. Around 1,000 military advisors landed on Congo. Fun fact, there were no nuclear wars in the independence of Congo. Here are some consequences of the civil society. There was a lot of political instability, there were a lot of economic struggles, and there was social upheaval. Civil society encountered disruptions in government, possible violence, and difficulties to adjust to a new political system. Furthermore, tensions are those between various ethnic and political factions, making the transition period even more complex. The aftermath of Congo's independence has been filled with political unrest, economic explosions, and conflicts over natural resources. Observing the decades-long conflict in Congo's resources, eastern provinces, the country is embroiled in an ongoing confrontation with Rwanda. In return, Kigali accused Kinshasa of supporting Hutu extreme militants and increasing its military presence inside of the Congo. 3 days later, the White House announced that it had brokered a 72-hour ceasefire in the eastern of Congo, including a partial drawdown of the M23. In May, the South African Development Community agreed to deploy troops to the eastern Congo to assist the UN forces ahead of the December 2023 elections. Approximately 1 million Congolese nations are seeking refuge beyond the Congo's borders. Thank you for your attention.
Okay, to begin with the Vietnam War. The Vietnam War is an event that took place or occurred in a period of 20 years. It occurred from 1955 to 1975. Okay, to begin with a little bit of context, this whole conflict began with the desire from Viet Minh, from Communist Viet Minh, to unify Vietnam under a single communist government. Then this conflict quickly escalated with the involvement of the United States. In support of the South Vietnam in its fight against the Communist North. This war was very famous or very characterized by guerrilla warfare, by US bombing campaigns against Vietnam, North Vietnam, and the use of chemical weapons that affected millions of people. Despite the U.S. military involvement, the U.S. Vietnamese forces supported by the Soviet Union and China somehow prevailed. Despite the U.S. military involvement, the North Vietnamese forces supported by Soviet Union and China somehow prevailed. In the moment, U.S. was considered, or right now also as well, the U.S. was considered a country that has a lot of military presence, and it's a very feared country because of the military forces and its war strength and history, and also economy. So yeah, this left behind a legacy of political division and controversy over American involvement. Okay, so U.S. lost. This war concluded or ended after 20 years with the reunification of Vietnam under a single communist rule after the fall of Saigon in 1975, leaving behind a legacy of political division and controversy over American involvement. Okay, so now let's go ahead with the questions. Was there any interference from the USSR in the conflict? If so, what was the benefit of said intervention of each side? During the war, both USA and USSR intervened in the conflict. The US supported South Vietnam to prevent the spread of communism in Southern Asia, also maintaining influence over the USSR during the Cold War. In the other side, the USSR supported North Vietnam to achieve a single communist Vietnam and challenge American dominance in the region. However, the war resulted in immense human suffering and lasting consequences for Vietnam and Vietnam people. Okay, some of the most important people that took place, or key people in this event, were Ho Chi Minh, that in the moment he was the leader of the communist Viet Minh and later North Vietnam. Okay, we can also add Ngo Dinh Minh, that he was the first president of South Vietnam supported by the USA. Lyndon B. Johnson also took an important place in this war. He was the president of the United States during a portion of Vietnam War. Also, Richard Nixon was one of the key people that intervened in this conflict, or that were involved in this conflict. He was the president who negotiated Paris Peace Accords to end the USA involvement, and he was the US president during a long part of this war. Also, Nikita Khrushchev was the leader of the Soviet Union during early years of the Vietnam War, and he was deeply involved in this conflict. And to conclude, we can add Zhou Enlai, the Prime Minister of the People's Republic of China, who supported during the conflict in the North Vietnam, or the communist side. As I mentioned before, during the conflict, both USA and USSR intervened in the conflict. The US supported South Vietnam to prevent the spread of communism in Southern Asia, also maintaining an important influence over the USSR during the Cold War. And of course, the USSR supported the North Vietnam for achieving their single communist government. During the Vietnam War, specifically the Vietnam War, there wasn't a direct threat of nuclear war, but the conflict played out during the Cold War. But the outcome of the war was very important. A victory for the US might have deterred future communist aggressions, potentially reducing the risk of nuclear confrontation from the part of the USSR. Okay, and so to conclude with this topic, the Vietnam War was an important war that played out an important role in US and USSR's history and Cold War's history, and also in global history. Okay, this war shaped a lot the course of the history itself because of the outcomes of this war.